it's what Sylvan's last comment about humanity is a great way to launch this panel. I also thought his comment that 150 million people visit art museums and 3 billion people are playing in the metaverse was a great perspective of the inclusion challenge. And I have an amazing panel. What I'd like to do is I will take Robin's lead and introduce them one by one and ask them to describe what they think the biggest inclusion challenge is and their thoughts about what's important as we shape this new world and not make the mistakes we made with social media. Let's begin with Karen Baker, who founded Boathouse and has been a senior advisor on inclusion issues to executives for a while now, and she just published a piece in the Harvard Business Review on inclusion in the metaverse and is featured this week on our podcast. Karen?
Hey everybody, glad to be here. Thanks for having me. It's interesting because, one of the areas that I think, and we talked about this on the podcast, is looking at the world of design as a practice, and how designers play a role in what we bring into cities from a metaverse perspective. And that ability to see inclusion within designers and creators that are part of what we bring to the metaverse, I think is key for being able to deliver what I say lived experience of those who are typically left out of the conversation, left out of technology, having to be on the tail end of its usage, or never even picking it up at all. So I'm here in Washington, D.C., and they just announced in March they're going to start using the metaverse in order to look at the enormous amount of vacant buildings that we have here in the city as a result of COVID. And so I'm keeping my eyes peeled to see how this works and how they actually unfold it as well.
Thank you. Let me next jump to Dennis. The first time I had coffee with Dennis, he had started a company. I didn't quite understand what it was doing. He had started two before and been super successful. And I said, what are you really trying to do? And he said, technology can serve so many people that aren't served today. I want to find ways to take technology and create access to things people don't have. So that it just stuck in my mind when we had coffee at the news bar, and love your perspectives.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I know you started saying, like, how do we make sure the next generation of technology doesn't, isn't as exclusive as, say, like, the early days of social networking was, and it's already going down that path, right? Like, if you look at, the early days of Google on mobile or even on Twitter, like, everything was designed to work on lowest common denominator devices. You could use a mobile browser, you could use text messaging, like, you had to have a phone, yes, in order to access the mobile internet, but you could have any type of device in order to do that. And, like, we're just not seeing that happen with the latest round of metaverse related things. Like, things require really advanced hardware. Things require really advanced computing chips within those hardware. For anyone that's designing or building this stuff, you have to often make a decision like, are we going to support, it's not like, it is, like, we're not going to support Android because only iPhone has the phones, but it's like, no, only the newest iPhones can do it. Only the newest PCs can do it. Only the newest headset can do it. So a lot of the most interesting things that are being designed and built, which is supposed to be for the masses, for everyone to enjoy, are totally inaccessible just because you need to have the latest and greatest hardware in order to get there. And I think it's going to be a long time before the lowest common denominator versions of those things are accessible, therefore, making the access to those things a little bit more equitable. So the original question was, how do you fix it?
Yeah, what's your advice here? What do we need to be worrying about as we're shaping this world?
I don't know. I don't know how you fix that, because it is kind of at the bleeding edge of a lot of, like, what's recently possible. So yes, it does require some of the more advanced technology and more advanced hardware. But I think the key is just being mindful from the very beginning that like, hey, we're supposed to be making things that everyone can enjoy. And in the process of like doing some of the early R&D work here, like that's not the case. And you have to go out of your way in order to make those things accessible.
Thank you. Let me move it to Annelise, who has been working as a kind of founding member of the collaboration since we began, and really keeps reminding me about communication and language and accessibility and how important that is here, and its role. And in some sense, my son calls this the communication revolution. So I'm curious.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. So yeah, what do each of us think about when we think about the metaverse and language inclusion and language access? Do we think about everyone having to use a globalized English or a global Chinese or a Sinophonic English, or instead about instantaneously available translation and interpreting? But into what languages? Today, less than half of the world's population speaks the top 10 languages, and there are over 7,000 languages spoken. I am myself a translator from Chinese. I have the privilege to direct a graduate program in translation and interpreting here, where we train students in everything from human translation proper to machine translation, which means training them not only to translate, but how to train translation technology, which gets really expensive. And job postings for translators are often advertisements seeking cyborgs, listing the required qualifications for translators and for their technology. The hiring party needs to know which software comes pre-installed. So as you can imagine, they worry about their professions, but they're also very hopeful. We provide them with scholarships and with training of the best possible education, and those are our secrets to student success. But when we're thinking about the metaverse, suffice to say that the techno-utopian dream of Babel or Babelfish or that app in my ear that tells me what you mean is very much with us, especially with the advent of large language models underpinning ChatGPT, etc. So today it is the best of times and the worst of times for translators and interpreters.
So now we're coming to Dele. We met probably 1 year ago today at Coinbase, and we were on a panel together on governance. And we were both talking about inclusion. And then we kind of went over in a corner and went back and forth. And I learned that Dele began working on this issue when we were in Web 1. And it has really been a pioneer and a fighter for inclusion for a long time.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, listening to everyone, it just really, it's hard to, it becomes a bit overwhelming, doesn't it? Because the problem just becomes so thick. I agree. I mean, you know, this technology has a huge potential to be a global leveler. But, you know, what use is ChatGPT if you don't even have a smartphone? And there are many boroughs in many parts of New York City where people don't have smartphones. You know, this is not, we're living in an increasingly multi-tiered society, and the barriers to access or transition through those tiers are so solid yet so invisible. And this is a real problem. And we are creating this new technological paradigm that's going to reshape the world in many senses. So before you can even get to the conversation about language and meaning and intent, you know, access becomes really problematic. And, you know, I think we really do have to rethink all of this. It's hard to see how we progress without a massive, ironically, leap in intelligence in terms of actually thinking this through from a more holistic perspective, or some sort of cataclysmic event that forces us to relook at the world from a different lens. And I think in that sense, you know, when we think about inclusion, where I'm increasingly finding myself today is not to move away from the argument about inclusion because it's ethical or, moral or, socially, right. But to think of it more, if you think of it just from a perspective of efficacy, from prosperity, from productivity, then it is the parts of the world where there are more inclusive frameworks, where information can be more widely dispersed, that generate richer content. By that I mean core data, inputs, insights, perspectives. These are the ones that are going to vastly outperform in the creation of these new technologies. So I think it's that kind of new perspective. If society is led by greed, which seems to be the case very much today, then how do we use greed to engineer a better perspective to achieve better outcomes?
Are you suggesting we lean into greed?
I wouldn't put it in those words. That's not quite what I'm saying. But I do think that we need to present the case for inclusion in a different way. So if we look at hardware, for example, well, okay, and the world is going increasingly virtual. Look at the pandemic. Would it not have been more sensible for the state to deploy, to provide every kid with a computer or a smartphone during that period, considering how much we spent on so many other things, to break that digital divide, not because it's a good thing, not because it's like, let's make sure that everybody's voice is heard, but because having everybody's voice heard makes us much more productive, makes us much more competitive.
Karen, when we spoke, my memory has it, one of the invisible issues in inclusion is VC. How much VC money goes into a business that someone white is starting versus the same business that someone black is starting? And so there aren't the business startups. It's not an equitable world. Could you spend a couple minutes on that, and if I got that issue right?
No, you did get it right. And so happened last night, I was at a financial inclusion for open technology meeting, and education is key. And I think, what Dele is saying, Dennis and Annelise, is that maybe we need a slow movement with Metaverse. Is it the same thing people are pushing for AI? But yeah, absolutely, in the business world, the funding, if you talk about developers, designers of color, what they're being offered is significantly less to bring technology to the table that they're saying, white counterpart is actually being offered. Many horror stories I'm hearing, I heard horror stories last night as well too, of what it means to offer financial inclusion when you talk about technology and innovation. And the metaverse is no different. And so even when you speak, Dele, about the digital divide, what wants to be said is that, everybody has access to the internet, but everybody can't afford the access to the internet. Particularly, we know with the metaverse, you need high speed, and everybody doesn't have that. And so being able to use their phone in order to do that, along with the wearable technology that's required, that has to be considered. And I think even when you talk about inclusion, I think people have to bring in the lens of what is equity. And people have a tendency to look at equitable and equal the same, and they are not the same. So because I allow you to be able to walk in a Best Buy and buy the metaverse technology, the Oculus glasses, that doesn't mean it's equitable, meaning it's affordable for you to be able to achieve that based on where you stand and your stance right now and how you live. So absolutely, from a business perspective, financial inclusion is important in this conversation as well.
Many years ago, I had the opportunity to meet Jackie Robinson, and I grew up in Indiana, and he shook my hand, and he asked me where I was from, and I said, Indiana, and he said, Indiana is the most prejudiced state in the nation. And I was like, no, it's not. And it was like, why do you say that? And he said, because they don't know they are, and if they don't know they are, they can't fix it. And it's really stuck in my mind. And when we first spoke, Karen, I didn't know there was such divide in VC. I didn't know there was such divide in languages. Are there other things we should be conscious of, Dennis, Del, Annelise, Karen, that we ought to put in front of ourselves so we're not from Indiana?
So large language models, our chat GPTs, our machine translators, they're built on vast swaths of text and bodies and corpora created by human translators and human writers. And what's been pointed to by a number of data ethicists is that that's hoovering up all our biases as it does that. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of stochastic parrots. We can talk about that more. But it is replicating all of those, and so there have been calls to slow down, as Karen was saying, to look at small language models rather than large language models, and not simply to replicate what comes to us from the past.
Yeah, and that's the example I keep hearing. It's like if you're training any type of model on a large corpus of data, and the data happens to be biased in a way that humans can't tell, then even if humans can't tell it or they figure it out after the fact, then those biases get automatically built in. So that's like a perfect answer. I mean, what came to mind when you were mentioning that is just like, I've been through the process of building companies a bunch of times, and in the early stages, sometimes like we weren't, and this is, we weren't focused on trying to build a diverse team. We're just focused on trying to build a team as quickly as possible. And you're hiring all of your friends, and you're hiring people that have the same experiences as you. And before you know it, like you've got this team, and you're all working together, and it's like, yeah, well, we're building stuff that's just for us. And it was a really hard lesson for me to learn personally that, like, hey, if you want to build things that are not just used by people like yourself, and you want to build things that are used by millions of people around the country, around the world, from all sorts of different backgrounds, like you need to have team members that are from those different backgrounds, from those different communities, have had different experiences, and they bring different things to the table in terms of design, in terms of product development, in terms of copywriting, in terms of thinking about the way these pieces come together, like whether it's, a socioeconomic background or race or gender, or just like, parents or single folks, like just any and all types of diversity when you're building companies. It's just like it's much easier today to look and say, of course, that's what you need to build these successful products. But it wasn't an obvious thing many years ago, and it was a really challenging lesson to learn as we were trying to do that.
Karen, is there anything else you want to put on the table here?
There's a book called Collective Genius. That's what you're saying. You need a collective genius. You need a team that is interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, has diverse cultures at the table as well too. Because otherwise, you're not innovating. You more than likely you're not pushing the envelope of what can actually go out into the universe. And you may think that you are, but you're not. Because at the end of the day, that's the way to innovate, is to bring all the levels of diversity on many different levels into the conversation at the table and be open to receiving what they have to offer. That's the bigger thing. They got to be open to receiving what they have to offer as well. So yeah, that's the point I wanted to make.
I have one last question for everyone. How would you know we were on the right path to success 2 years from today? Not what would success look like, but what would you be looking for 2 years from today to feel like we weren't reinventing social media or the mistakes of social media?
It's a great question. This is I don't know if this is a good answer or not, but like, I play with the Oculus and other tools and technology, and I go through the App Store, and it doesn't represent the same type of like it seems like it's all being designed by the same group of people for the same group of people. And a lot of, like, whether they're games or different experiences, there's just like, one of the wonderful things about New York that I love is like you walk through the street and you're just reminded like everyone's different, everyone has a different story, like everyone has different interests. It's like one of my favorite parts about New York. It's one of my favorite parts about raising kids in New York. And sometimes when I do these things, whether they're online, with games, with headsets, with AR experiences, I get a sense that it's the same group of people, always designing for the same group of people, and there's just, like, we haven't broken out of that yet. And I think the moment that you can, go, like you can browse through the variety of experiences that are available for some of these devices and be like, hey, there's stuff here that I'm interested in, and there's things here that I'm not interested at all in, and there's things here that I can imagine tons of other people that would be interested in that are outside of my interest. And just like much, like, the obviousness of things being in the store being built for a wide variety of different communities and different audiences, and I don't see any of that stuff at the moment.
So when you can see all of us, the world, in that app.
That's a more eloquent way of trying to say what I was saying, but yes, I think you get the gist of it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think when you see better representation, and I think what will come from that over the horizon of 2 years or so is that we'll actually start to have much more difficult conversations. And I think that when we're actually in the trenches, really having hard conversations, difficult conversations, I think it's very honest what Dennis said in terms of, when you're starting a company, you're just trying to get the company started, and it's like, how do I get it going, and you're pulling on the resources that you have at hand. That's the natural sort of approach that you have. But I think when we have better representation and more inclusion and more involvement, then we'll start to unpack the issues. And there are a lot of issues that need unpacking. So for me, in 2 years' time, if we're actually, I think what you said about the Indiana analogy is so spot on. People are blind to the problem. And until we're actually able to address the problem and talk about it, it's not going to go away. So I think in 2 years' time, if we're able to have more difficult conversations, then I think we'll be on the road to progress.
It's a really hard question, but one of the things that the language industry has learned in the last 6 or 7 years with the advent of neural network translation and AI-generated translation is that the more translation and interpreting you have, the more translation and interpreting you need. So in 2 years, it would be seen, as we've talked about, the long tail of languages of lesser diffusion being available both to machine translation and to human translators, and the translators and interpreters themselves being a more diverse body, drawing from heritage speakers and being more representative.
Karen?
Yeah, this is a systematic problem. It's embedded with a long history. So I think 2 years from now, I think just really hearing better conversations. Like if we came back 2 years from now, all of us together, we would be having better stories to tell. I think that's really will be a great start for us right now, because this is a systematic problem that's really embedded for a very long time, and it's a lot of work to do, really.
Thank you. Thank you. Any final words or?
I suppose just that, for me, I think this all can often sound gloomy and, pessimistic, but, we do have a very powerful technology, a suite of technologies in our hands. We are at a really incredible nexus point in our evolution as humans. And so it is a really important time. And I think we just need to muster the will, and I think it's by having these conversations and being purposeful and thoughtful about this, we do have the tools to make this, to really transform the world. And I don't know that the world's ever going to be some utopia, but it can certainly be a lot better than it is. And I think that this technology, this suite of technologies, and there is a convergence that's happening of fundamentally transformative technologies. And, the world's just gone mad on ChatGPT, which is one very narrow sliver of AI, effectively generative AI even itself. The more broad category itself is still one very narrow category of AI. And there will be another one next year. So there are all these really transformative technologies that are really coming to fruition now. But we really need to get to the human story behind all of this and really use that to drive the evolution, which I think if we do, then very bright days are ahead.
And cities have a very important role.
Oh. No, I was going to say, about what's there to be like hopeful about, right? Like, I think it's, I think in the age of social media, we all kind of went into it with blind optimism. Like, I'm trying to think back to those early days of Twitter, 2007, 2008, 2009, wait, before then. And it was just, it felt like, oh my gosh, all sorts of interesting things happen. It's going to bring everyone together. And everyone was like blindly optimistic about it. And then now we're just like, gosh, how toxic was all of that? And if anything, like, you can argue, hey, everything with AI and ChatGPT and all the large language models, it's all happening too fast. We need to pause it. Blah, blah, blah. Like, there's tons of arguments you can make around that. But like, I think I'm kind of thankful that there's so many folks that are raising their hands saying like, this might be bad. This might not be inclusive. We've learned a lot from social media. We've learned a lot from training algorithms. We've learned a lot from machine learning. And so I feel like we're not going into it as blind as we were with social media, right? And so maybe that's a good thing, and maybe that will help us, or maybe it won't, and we just won't look at any of the warnings and we'll just blow by them all. But sometimes there does seem to be a bit of optimism in here, that at least we're having these conversations in the early days of some of this stuff. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Thank you very much.